foundational lecture, I want to talk about some of the greats in ethnographic anthropology. Today, I'm going to talk about Mary Douglas, and in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about Victor and Edith Turner. We can kind of designate these as structures and anti-structures. These three theoreticians were all greats of British cultural anthropology in the mid-20th century. Mary Douglas, Victor, and Edith Turner were all contemporaries. All three were born between the years of 1920 and 1921 in England. Victor Turner died in 1983, Mary Douglas in 2007, and Edith Turner in 2016. So they all were working at the same time and were really working off of one another's insights. All three were Catholic. Mary Douglas grew up in a Catholic family, and the Turners converted in 1958. So they were all very invested in and interested in Catholic liturgical rites, as well as rites, especially in Africa, but throughout the world. There are a couple of different concepts that I want to talk about that are really important when we think about Mary Douglas's work in particular, and then also the Turners. So the first one is that the body reflects culture, and we think about that concept in two different ways. So first of all, there's the way that the physiological body reflects the culture that it was raised in or reared in. So if we look at this image of the Kung Bushmen who are discussed in the readings that we read from Mary Douglas's work today, you can see a squat that actually would be really difficult to replicate in a North American culture. So in North America, we are a sitting culture. So we're raised. So for example, I'm sitting right now. I'm very comfortable sitting for long periods of time. I'm not comfortable squatting for long periods of time. This is an insight that actually Marcel Mauss developed in the very early 20th century anthropology and sociology. And he talked about the difference between sitting and squatting cultures. And one of the things he talked about is that if you're in a culture where you spend a lot of time squatting, you develop the muscles that are necessary for this kind of musculature and this kind of position. Whereas those of us who grew up in sitting cultures, we never actually developed these muscles. And so it's actually not possible for us to do what this young man here is doing. So this concept was one that Marcel Mauss called the habitus. The habitus is the way that the human physical body, in its capacities and its incapacities, in its bones, its muscles, and its nerves, reflect the enculturated values and the postures that are specific to culture. That's one of the ways that body reflects culture. There's another way that the body reflects culture, which we can call social symbolism, which is the way that the human body actually symbolically reflects the whole social world. So, for example, we saw in the reading from Mary Douglas that what you put in your mouth actually symbolizes certain things about your culture. What's edible and inedible reflects certain kinds of key distinctions that are important about your social world. So that's something that's also really important. These two different ways of thinking about the human body and its relationship to the cultural world are both really important and are reflected over the long history of Mary Douglas's works. So the first rating that we did for today is from her 1996 book, Purity and Danger, which is probably still her best known and most read book. And in that book, she reflects a lot on taxonomy in culture, the ways that we look at things that don't fit really clearly in one category or another, and how we deal with those kinds of categories in the way that certain key elements of our culture reflect what we feel is disturbing our primary key categories. In 1972, she published an essay called Deciphering a Meal, which you also read. And in that essay, she actually goes back to one of the chapters in Purity and Danger where she looked at Israelite laws about consumption and sacrifice. So what we're seeing here is kind of a revision of that early work on this topic. And then much later in 1999, she published a second book, not her second book. She published an entire book on Leviticus called Leviticus as Literature, where she explores this theme further. So we're kind of looking at a mid-ground in between these different explorations of these different types of relationship between the human body and the social body. Each of these varies from culture to culture. And one of the things that's particularly interesting and significant about Mary Douglas's work is that she's really interested in looking at why a particular symbolic representation comes to stand for a particular thing in a certain culture. So she's really interested in the close relationships between a careful examination of social relationships in a culture and the symbols, the embodied symbols that represent and also reinforce that social structure. I wanted to look at a different example than the one she explores. So I want to start by talking about the part of her essay where she discusses what we might call the progressive intimacy of meals. So she talks about the way that meals are more intimate than snacks, and snacks are more intimate than drinks in her own mid-century British culture. And for example, one of the small details that she uses to show what she means is that in a meal you have implements that go inside the mouth, and that the use of silverware that goes inside the mouth rather than silverware that touches the hand but not the mouth, like when you're stirring tea, shows a progressive level of intimacy over something where we just have finger foods that are used with the hands that are supposed to be clean and not sticky. So I want to show you the ways that some of these same values about intimacy are displayed in a slightly different culture in the American South. In this case, this is in Richmond, Virginia. And this particular house is now a museum, which is why there's a floor plan online. And so this is the Maggie Lena Walker House in Richmond, Virginia. If we look at this house from the late 19th century, we can see a set of distinctions that are embodied in the house itself that reflect key distinctions in the social life at the time. So if we look at this, we can see this is the public entrance of this house. Here we have the foyer, which would be the entryway that guests would use. We have the front parlor and we have the rear parlor. Both of these are public spaces that would be used for guests, even very not very well known guests, so guests that didn't have a lot of intimacy with the family. If we go a step further in, you can see the dining room. So whereas the front and rear parlor might be a place where you would serve drinks, and with the drinks, light food, the dining room is a slightly more intimate space where family would sit down and eat with people. So that's a distinction between, if you will, parlor guests and dining room guests that would have also been reflected in visiting. So if you visited and you only were shown the parlor, versus if you were invited for dinner and you stayed and you were able to step further into the house, into the dining room. Progressively more intimate than this would be the library, the den, and the kitchen in different ways, which would have been mostly reserved to the needs of the household themselves. And then if you go up the stairs, which are here, so here these are the front stairs, if you went up the stairs, then you're in the really private space that's really reserved for the family themselves. So what the distinction that this house is telling us, the social distinctions that this house makes, and makes importantly, and embodies in our actual behavior, are distinctions between the family and different types of guests, where some of the guests might be dining room guests and some of the guests might be front or rear parlor guests, and some of the guests might in fact be invited into the den or the library. If we look at another house from the late 19th century, you can see a different floor plan that expresses the same sort of reservations with regard to social visiting. So here we also have a parlor. And you can see the dining room is the slightly more intimate space behind it. And the hall is the public area that gives guests access to each of these spaces from the outdoor space of the veranda. This outdoor space is a public space. It's visible from the street. These are progressively more intimate spaces. The sitting room would have been for the family itself. And here we have a back hallway, which again is for the family, not for guests, and the kitchen, the bedroom, and then there's upstairs more bedrooms. So then if we look, for example, at a 2010 floor plan, we see a radically different social environment being embodied here. So here again, we have the front porch, and then a hall, but there's no distinction now between, there's no parlor, there's no public entertaining room, and then a private family leisure room. Rather, there's one area, including a dining room and a great room, that's intended both for the family and for visitors. So that key distinction between public and private space is not being drawn in the same location in this house. At the same time, we also see that some of the outside space has been converted into more private space. So on this side, we have a master bedroom, and that master bedroom is divided from the other bedrooms on the other side of the house. So whereas the 19th century houses, those bedrooms might have been closer together, like we saw in the first example, here they're divided. So here we have the other bedroom and an office, and those open up onto a shared porch, but the master bedroom has its own porch. And then there's a back porch that's part of the entertaining space of this house. So what we're seeing here is that the significant distinction that's being made is not between family and guests, but rather probably between parents and children. So between the occupants of this master bedroom, whose privacy is assured by the structure of the house layout, and the occupant of this other bedroom and the office, whose privacy is given less distinction. So, and then the private public space, the private entertaining space in the back. So we saw this reflected a bit even in Mary Douglas's essay, where she reflects on the rise of barbecues as outdoor public-private entertaining spaces that are somehow less intimate than a dining room, but more intimate than snacks. And we're starting to see more of a blurred boundary here in this floor plan from 2010. I wanted to kind of give you that sense of the way that the culture shifts over time, and things as seemingly mundane and unconnected as our floor plans really reflect some of these changes in our social structures. We can talk more about what those social structures imply in class. So when we look at the way that she examines meal structures, what I really want to focus on is the way that macro and micro structures allow room for progression within the ritual status of something as mundane as a meal. So, for example, in her discussion of British dining habits from the mid-century, she talks about the way that one thing that's expected in even a weeknight supper is that there be one major course. And what makes a major course is that it consists of three elements. One of the elements is sort of the primary and foregrounded, and then the other two elements are secondary and are backgrounded. So that's what constitutes a course. There's one stressed plate and two unstressed plates. She takes this notion of stress from poetry. When there's a weekly solemn meal, which for her is the Sunday lunch meal, we expect two major courses. That's one of the ways that the solemnity of a Sunday meal is emphasized vis-a-vis a regular meal. When there's an annual solemn meal, like Christmas or Easter, we expect three courses, one major course and two minor courses, and each of the minor courses is similarly going to be one stressed plate and two unstressed plates. So there's multiple levels of distinction here, but there's one overarching kind of understated expectation, which is that there be a stressed element combined with two minor elements to complement it. So when we look at the funny example that she begins this article with, a soup and a pudding course is a 2B. So there's no major course composed of a stressed plate and two unstressed plates. So even for a weeknight supper, that's not acceptable as a full meal. whereas Welsh rarebit, which is a toast with fried cheese on it and some kind of greenery on the side, constitutes the A. There's one stressed element, which is the bread, and then there's the two unstressed element, which is the cheese and parsley, she says at one point later on in the text. So when we look at this, we can see that even a relatively minor and mundane meal, like the one that she begins the essay with, reflects the structure that would be expected of a big solemn or even a religious meal, which is part of what she's talking about the systemic relationships within the culture as a whole, where even though there's a lot of variability, even in the very simple version, you can still see an echo of the very solemn version of the ritual. So to take this into the religious ritual that she discusses 72 and onward, we see a really different set of distinctions. So there's really not any overlap between that set of distinctions that she developed for mid-century English meal practice and the one that she's developing for Hebrew meal practice. And I think that we should respect the fact that she sees these as really very divergent. But what's happening here is we have the production of some key cosmological ideas on the basis of the Hebrew meal patterns. So if we turn to the religious ritual for Douglas, she's thinking about the way that God is presented in Leviticus, and the way that she sees God represented in the Torah is as a figure of life, especially the origin of all life, and also that the meal practices in the Hebrew Bible communicate that all life belongs to God. So we can see this in one way because we can see the way that the whole cosmological world is represented by the categories water, air, and land. And in each of these categories, certain members are eligible for being eaten and other members are not. So the way we think about the abominable category here is the abominable category is reserved to God in that they're not acceptable for the human table. And so whereas the activities that are sort of challenging to God's lordship over life are primarily the eating of an animal, because that challenges the wholeness of the animal and is taking its life away. And also procreation, which threatens the integrity of the human body, because in the acts that are associated with procreation, fluids come out of the human body that are not normally coming out of the human body. So it threatens the actual integrity of the skin of the human body, which represents a threat to the community because it represents the outside of the community being threatened by people outside or by the improper behavior inside the community. So if eating and procreation are the two kind of challenging activities, in Douglas's estimation, there are two strategies for proclaiming symbolically that all life belongs to God. The first strategy is by avoiding eating some life. So the category abominable in each one of these is a category that includes animals that replicate in ways that are strange or threatening, or that in some other way don't seem to be at the center of human domestic life. So that category is always off the table, so to speak. In each of these three categories, there are also animals that are fit for the table. So the most complex one of these diagrams is the one for the land animals. So that's the one we're going to focus on here. So if we look at category A, that's the category of animals that have 4 legs and either walk or hop. And in each of these categories, everything that can be eaten falls within the A category. It can walk and or it hops and it has 4 legs. However, not everything that walks and hops with 4 legs can be eaten. And so we have a subcategory that includes things like the pig. And the pig is a special category for Mary Douglas because it represents a number of different ways that the Israelites are set apart from other nations. First of all, it's set apart because unlike the other domestic herds and flocks, it doesn't have a unified hoof or chew cud. And so in that way, it's set apart. It's also set apart because it's one of the prime foods that's raised by the surrounding nations who are pagan. So by abstaining from it, they isolate themselves from the pagan table. It's also set apart because it eats refuse, and so it becomes symbolically a sign of the kind of behavior that is outside of the Jewish law. So that's why there are certain animals that seem like they might be acceptable for eating, but aren't acceptable for eating. The B category is the category of things that are fit for the table, which includes domestic herds and flocks, but also other animals that might be hunted as game, like antelope or deer of some sort. So if we look at that category, that's the category people are eating. That's what they're putting on the table. Within that category, there's a certain subset of that category here, D, that's acceptable for sacrifice. So that part of the animal, there are certain animals that you don't eat yourself because you offer them to God. And at the temple, the blood of the animal and the meat of the animal and the fat of the animal are all offered to God. So that's one of the strategies for remembering that all the animals in the B category belong to God. The other strategy for remembering that all the animals in the B category belong to God is that whenever any animal in the B category is eaten, the blood is drained and the blood is offered to God. So these are the two ways by their eating habits that Israelites connect the temple where some of the animals are sacrificed with their regular restrictions on dining. This main category that differentiates, the main strong differentiation in this social structure is not between guests and the family, like we saw before, between what is different generations in the same house, but rather at this B line, what can be eaten and what can't be eaten, which for Douglas reflects a strong line between the Israelites who all eat together and the members of other nations who are not to eat or procreate with Israel. So I hope that's a helpful introduction to this essay on Hebrew social structures. I want to end with this quotation from page 78, which really just sums up what I've said so far. First, there are the creatures whose behavior defies the rigid classification. This is X. It's relatively easy to deal with them by rejection and avoidance. Second, there are the difficulties that arise from our biological condition. It is all very well to worship the holiness of God in the perfection of his creation, but the Israelites must be nourished and must reproduce. It is impossible for a pastoral people to eat their flocks and herds without damaging the bodily completeness they respect. It is impossible to renew Israel without emission of blood and sexual fluids. These problems are met sometimes by avoidance and sometimes by consecration to the temple. The draining of blood from meat is a ritual act, which figures the bloody sacrifice at the altar. Meat is thus transformed from a living creature into a food item. So that last notion is the way that this micro-ritual, which echoes the solemn ritual at the altar, actually transforms meat from a living animal which belongs to God into a food item that can be used to nourish the human social body. Thanks. This is Mary Douglas.